Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello, it's me, Phil Craig, back at the Australian bar. I have been travelling. I have many things to tell. Many tales to tell and updates to deliver and views to impart. It could be quite a long intro. As ever, you can go straight to the main body of the programme anytime you like. And I think you'll like this one. Sam Kelly talking about how everybody important in history was basically stoned all the time. Well, okay, that's a slight exaggeration, but only a slight exaggeration. Yeah, Sam will be on the show later talking about his book, about history on drugs, and many scandalous tales does it include. But yeah, so the intro. Wow, gosh, it's going to be quite a lot to say, I think. Lovely response to last. Well, I'm still getting responses to the cricket show that's nearly a month old, and comments, and also lovely comments for Victoria Taylor and our conversation in our last episode about the Battle of Britain. It's also a comment of the month. Stand by your beds. Chris H2277. Not a fan of cricket, being a girl. Oh, I don't know about that these days. Anyway, growing up in Australia, it was a completely macho province. Macho province, with very large moustaches, loads of gold jewellery, and poor sportsmanship. Underarm bowling, aluminium bats, and getting drunk on planes. Sounds like a lovely kind of stag weekend, doesn't it? Anyway, yeah, Australian cricket was like a long stag weekend in the 70s and 80s. Chris wasn't a fan because she was a girl. It was a very macho sport then. It's changed a lot, actually. I think probably for the better, although some of those characters back in the day, they were quite entertaining. Ricky Harcourt. Hello, Ricky. I'm sure you've been on here before, talking about the Battle of Britain. And then it made an interesting point here. You're a Blitz survivor, so you must have been born in the years just prior to the Second World War. Blitz survivor here, bowled over, listening to a beautiful young woman discussing in detail the whys and wherefores, how the world has changed, and it's wonderful. Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. I think most historians, even 20 years ago, writing about military history, would almost all have been blokes, and that really has changed. I talked about it a couple of episodes ago. I did a big talk at the Chalk Valley History Festival, and I'd say, which is a big deal here in Britain, and I'd say about half, maybe even more than half of the speakers this year were women. It's so much more diverse than it used to be, which is a good thing. And Victoria's book is fun. And I would tell her you think she's beautiful. That's maybe I shouldn't actually. No, that's. But it was fun. Talking to her and fun listening to your comment, Ricky. Comment 2006. Fascinating interview, Phil, on the Luftwaffe's perspective on the Battle of Britain. Close to 20 years ago, I read Stephen Bungay's book on the battle. Yes, the most dangerous enemy. I think I mentioned that in my interview. 20 years ago, I was writing about the Battle of Britain too, and Stephen Bungay and I, both blokes, by the way, we were amongst the first, I think, to write about the Battle of Britain in a way that emphasised the RAF's strength and kind of modernity and professionalism. And that was a change. Because prior to that, as we discussed with Victoria, we tended to kind of overplay the underdog theme, I think. So yeah, Stephen was, I haven't seen him for years, but he was a mate. So thank you, Comet. Anyway, comment of the month. Jonathan Brewer, step forward. You've given me so much pleasure over the, what is it now, 2 years. You've commented on loads and loads of shows, often funny, sometimes cheeky, let's be honest. But also giving me loads of ideas for other programs. I haven't followed up on them all. You keep mentioning more sports, especially sprinting in the 80s and the scandals about doping, which I really must do one day. But you've been consistently entertaining, Jonathan, and a great friend of the podcast. So you're going to get a mug. If you want to contact us, if you look in the bio, there is an address for the producer. Email, please, and please include your address with postcode, because sometimes these mugs get lost and then they come back to me and I have to pay and people say I haven't got my mug, which is really annoying. So yeah, thank you, Jonathan. What comment in particular? Well, loads actually, but there was one a couple of episodes ago, I think at the beginning of the month, where you said that because of Mrs. Craig's acting ability, she should put herself forward to be in a show based on one of the episodes of the podcast. Yeah, because Mrs. Craig was on stage not too long ago, and I shared some pictures. I might share some pictures of her and me in a minute as well, actually. But yeah, Jonathan, well done. Thank you for being such a fan of the show. Send me an email with your address and we'll get you a lovely mug. One of the, I had a lot of comments actually, because at the beginning of the last episode, I spoke about Harry and William. As usual, a couple of you reprimanded me. It's nice people say, I didn't agree with you, Phil, but I enjoyed the program, or it's not what I normally listen to, but it was good to get an alternative view. I do like it when people say that. Marauder, IJ7, Marauder. I admire your podcasts and your fascinating guests, Phil, but I was offended about some of the things you said, that it's just down to a spat between the wives. Well, I mean, I don't think it's just down to a spat between the wives. I think there was a lot of tension building between Harry and William. We talked about this in the last episode. And I think the fact that their partners couldn't get on with each other pushed it into a new level. But you obviously think that I'm minimising some of the really bad things that the Sussexes have done. I don't think I am. In other episodes, I've spoken about how I thought the Netflix series was terrible, manipulative, exaggerated, and some of the things in Spare. Oh gosh, just don't agree with it. So yeah, I understand people feel very strongly about this. And yes, so Marauder, I hope you'll stay with me. After reading one of your books and listening to your podcasts, I thought you were more perceptive than that. Well, that's a very nice way to give me a slap on the wrist. And I take all criticism on board. I do, and especially people who take the time to write long and thoughtful comments like you did, Marauder. So thank you for that. Nothing much more to say on Harry. People are still briefing about this supposed peace offensive. Stories saying it's happening, stories saying it's not, stories saying the king is definitely going to go to the next Invictus Games, but William isn't. Who knows? But there's something afoot. And doubtless we'll learn more. But there was one royal story, which I don't know if how many of you noticed it, but I did. And it was about Charles. Now, of course, we're all very sympathetic to Charles. We're all happy that he's found love with Camilla, despite all of the trauma of the past and Diana and so on and so forth. And clearly, because he has or has had, I think he still has cancer, he's being treated, I believe, still. It's a little bit vague what his health status really is. We're sympathetic. But there was a rare negative story about him, which sort of had echoes of previous stories from earlier in his life, which is that he's quite a prickly man with quite a short temper, and he's losing gardeners at Highgrove. He's lost 11 out of 12 in the last 3 years, and some of them clearly have been leaking to the press. And this is the Times, which is not what you call a tabloid, ran a very long and well-briefed article about some of the sort of slightly snotty notes he was writing, getting cross because very small things hadn't worked, and saying things like, don't put that man in front of me again because he hadn't removed the right weed, correcting people's grammar, getting just very picky. And, he was always a bit like that in the Diana days. And sometimes staff would say, there's a famous story of him losing his temper with somebody for putting the wrong rug in the back of the Range Rover when he really yelled at the guy. And I happen to know this because I spoke to an eyewitness. So yeah, the wind's a temper. It's in him, it's in William, it's in Harry, maybe it's in Anne, I don't know. And that is perhaps one reason why these royal rows can get quite heated quite quickly and they're hard to resolve. But yeah, so that was an interesting story. I think you'll find it in the Times and the Telegraph about Charles and his gardener. So I went on a lovely podcast with a new friend of mine, Iona Italia, an Australian journalist, and she works for Quillette magazine, which I recommend to you. It's quite a cerebral, quite intellectual, fun, smart, open-minded magazine, and I did a long interview with her. And we ended up talking about my book, and one of the themes of my book is how history can be really annoying, because sometimes the wrong people are remembered for the wrong reasons. I've talked about this before on the podcast. There's a man called Subhash Chandra Bose. He's hailed as the great hero of Indian independence. I don't think he should be. I don't think he was, but a lot of Indians would disagree with me, including the Prime Minister of India. And I talk a little bit about how history and maybe certainly young people studying history, it's quite easy once they've gone and the world has moved on to turn these men of violence, these extremists, into heroes. And I actually likened it to the very controversial Irish band Kneecap, who are loud proponents of violent resistance in the context of the history of Ireland. That would obviously include the IRA, who they seem to have a great fondness for. And I was talking on this interview with Iona about how those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I was doing a lot of reporting in that time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, how it was so thrilling when the idea of peace became possible. This is captured quite beautifully in a brilliant series, which I'm sure many of you will have seen. If not, you really should, called Derry Girls. It's set in the 90s in Derry, London Derry, depending on how you want to call it. And it's a coming of age story that's also about the peace. It's about how people learn to reconcile and get beyond ancient hatreds and move forward. And it's very moving and very smart. And one of the most wonderful parts of it, actually, is when Clinton, who did such good work, I think, at that time, whatever you think of him, he did such good things for Ireland, came to Derry and made this very powerful speech about reconciliation. And pop stars, the Cranberries, famously with a song called Zombie, Bono from U2 got on stage and had a unionist and a Republican, and they held hands on stage, and they used to wave both flags, the British and the Irish flag, which is quite a dangerous thing to do. And young people got into this, and you can find great videos from that time of huge crowds cheering basically for peace and for the peacemakers. Because when you make peace, you have to make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. And that involves a certain amount of forgiveness. You let people out of prisons who've done terrible things. Just like in war, you let prisoners out of prison of war camp, some of whom may have done terrible things. That's just what happens with peace. But now, the people who were cheering Bono when he did that thing, or the Cranberries when they made that song, their children in Ireland are going to see Kneecap, and they're going, ooh, ah, up the rah. And the IRA liberated us. They're the heroes. And that's such an incredibly oversimplified account of what happened. And I think it's sad. I do link it actually to what happened in India with Bose. Is that if you're living in the same time as these people, the messy reality of the world they create, you want rid of them. And you want compromise. And you want to try and make peace. But looking back in a kind of football fan way, tribal chanting, if you get your history through TikTok, it's very easy to just buy into the identity of protest. And young people like to offend the elderly, don't they? Étaper les bourgeois, I think they would call it in French. Offend the middle class, respectable opinion by being really out there. And, there's probably part of that radical chic, I think they used to call it in America. But it does annoy me. And I think it's quite sad. And when you go to Ireland, which I did last week for a lovely holiday with Francis, and I'm going to share some photographs. So the last time I did this, people liked it. And as I say, if you think I'm just being self-indulgent, you can jump straight to Sam and the main body of this episode. But if I can remember how to do it, I'm going to share the screen. The question is, can I remember how to do it? Because this doesn't seem to be the same as it was before. Oh, that's because I'm looking at the wrong. Okay, bear with. Oh, this is slightly embarrassing. Okay. Aha, here we go. Now, everything connects. When I travel for work or for pleasure, I try to mix things up. So this is me meeting Chris Moore. Our very first episode of this podcast was me and Andrew talking about King Cora. I worked with Chris Moore in the early 1990s on this story. It's still going on. We've talked about it before. Unbelievable scandal. And the role of the British intelligence in stopping the police arresting these predatory paedophiles, because there was some intelligence game being played, and it's still not clear what it was. But the number of young men and boys who were harmed because of this. And Chris is still working on the story. That's his brand new book. If you're interested in the King Cora, I would recommend it to you. So we met for a pint I'm on the black stuff, the Guinness. He's got my book, I've got his. Old friends meeting in a Belfast pub. Yeah, so that was really interesting. But going back to what I was talking about, I'll rattle forward through all this. It's just, yes, we did a tour. Here we go. Belfast. You see the scars of war. People celebrate their side. That's a river. Obviously, Bobby Sands, a mural in the Republican area of Belfast. But you can actually travel in these black taxis, and a lot of the people doing it were former paramilitaries from both sides. It was clear that the person who drove us around was a Republican. But he told us this amazing story. In fact, he waved at somebody in another taxi because they employ people from both sides of this. And he said that guy is a UVF man. And we're friends. Well, we're sort of not enemies. And I thought that was really interesting, that that's what peace is about. You don't have to make friends with people. You know, he probably knows people who shot at or killed that man's mates. And certainly the UVF killed an awful lot of Catholics, many of whom were not involved really in the IRA. So both sides did terrible things. There were psychopaths attracted to these kind of groups. But, you know, you don't have to be friends, do you? Just don't be enemies. And they were working in the same company, which I thought that was a sign of progress. And Belfast, actually, having not been there for a while, did feel quite buzzy and positive. Lots of celebrations. Yeah, so you go around, they still have these peace walls between the communities, but the gates are more open than they used to be. And there's much more back and forth. Yeah, there's a loyalist area. You know, they love their Orange Order, things to do with the flute bands and the royal family. And this it was just on this street where my Republican, well, yes, taxi driver, who would not have felt safe there 20 years ago, 25 years ago, said hello to his mate. Well, you know, his non-enemy. I thought that was lovely. So yeah, Orange Hall. It's it's also incredibly beautiful place. Quick rattle through our pictures. It does rain a lot, as you can see. We got some sun. Yeah, stayed in the various lovely places. It's so fantastic. But it did make me think a little bit more about, about what I was just saying in Kneecap. How we do seem to be living in an age where an emotionally manipulative short video that gives a very one-sided account and presents people as heroes who really weren't can seize people's imagination. And yeah, it's fun to join a gang, isn't it? It's like being in a football crowd. But it's not that long ago where young people were much more sophisticated. And I think if you live in the times, as I said before, if you live through these times, you want it to stop. And you see both sides have got madmen and lunatics in them. And we went to the Fermanagh border where a friend of mine, Ian Asherson, grew up, and he's written these articles about the atrocities. And, you know, there's one story. We walked on a beach, not far from this beach. A girl from the Republic was killed, 27, I think she was, and she was going out with the Protestant from the other side of the border. And he had been a policeman. That made him a target for the IRA. And they shot up the car as they were going back from this on the beach. I mean, it's beautiful. Donegal is fabulous. The idea of just getting in your car after a lovely day on the beach and suddenly 4 men get out with balaclavas and start spraying machine guns, fire into you. She was killed. He survived extraordinarily. She was killed. 27 bullets, I think it was. No, she was 27. I think there was probably more bullets than that. Awful story of a girl from their own community murdered because she fell in love with the wrong man, you know. We also passed a bar as we drove back from London, as we were going around Londonderry, in a place called Greysteel, where Protestant gunmen turned up. They wanted to kill some IRA guys. Of course, they weren't there, but they shot up this bar. They killed like 8 people in a bar, just out for the evening. Not really involved, nobody. I mean, I think one of them might have been like a councillor in a Republican area, but these are civilians, and this is what happened. And so you can understand, if you live through that kind of horror, why you would find joy in a peace process, which is what Dairy Girls is all about. And also, I hope you'll understand why it's so incredibly annoying to see Kneecap kind of performing this ritual, this awfully twisted, one-sided celebration of people, many of whom are just psychopaths. So I feel quite strongly about that, about it happening, and also what it tells us about history and why it can be very, very unfair and annoying. Yeah, so like I said, I had quite a lot to say this morning. Although I quite like this rhythm of once every 2 weeks. I did promise to go back to once a week. I'm not sure anymore. maybe one long episode every fortnight, and they seem to do quite well. Some of them, I mean, it's all to do with the algorithm, isn't it? Like the cricket one obviously got a lot of attention in India because of the Test match, I suspect, that we're playing at the moment. But the Battle of Britain did pretty well. We will see. We will see. Oh, I'll let you into a secret. Somebody's asked us about a sponsorship deal. I have no idea if this will happen. And it probably will just be like, we'll pay for your mugs, Phil. But, something like that would make it quite a lot easier for me to do it once a week. So we'll see. I do still enjoy it, as you can probably tell. So thank you for bearing with me and suffering my holiday snaps, hearing my opinions on various things. Let's go and meet Sam, who's going to talk to us all about history and drugs. I should just say, before you meet Sam, Sam's open about his own autism. It's why he's such a great researcher. He's rather obsessive. He also has a manner where he speaks. He speaks a lot. So do I. That's what podcasting is all about. But his book is it's written in the kind of he's Californian, I think, or something from some part of America. And this book, most of the books I read and enjoy and talk about here are quite, traditional in the way that they're written. Sam's book is really different. It's quite funny, and it's written in a kind of 20-somethings or younger speech rhythms. I think heavily influenced by social media. So he'll say, he was talking about a pharaoh. He'll say, "This dude, he was mighty, but he was also high. Yes, he was high and mighty." So it's quite that's his style. I hope you enjoy him. I certainly did. I'll see you at the end of this, and thank you very much for listening thus far. Bye. Sam, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me very early, I think, wherever it is
Uh,
you are.
I'm in Los Angeles, so it's almost 9. It's not too early.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for giving me the best subtitle to a book I've read in a long time. An utterly scandalous but entirely truthful look at history under the influence. I do love that. That's very clever.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
Well, tell me first of all, your book it reads like a sort of it's not academic, it's not dry, it's very funny, and it reads like a really smart series of magazine articles, I'd say. What gave you the idea of taking all this knowledge that you've gathered and putting it down into a book?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I always loved good storytelling. That was one of the things that drew me to history as a field. I was very fortunate to have throughout my life so many amazing history teachers who they really brought out the appeal and just the narrative and the sense of yes, these are fascinating truth stories of things that happened to real people, and so they were able to always get me away from the sense of history as being like a dry thing. And so I wanted to share that sensibility with other people. And I noticed that in a lot of mainstream tellings of history, there would be occasional mentions of substance use, but they would almost bat them aside like they weren't interesting. And I'm thinking, well, no, this is very interesting. Why are you not expanding on this more? Because this would be fascinating to hear about. And I kept finding that if you just pulled on a few threads, went down some rabbit holes, or even just looked at the list of someone's work, you could often find evidence of them being engaged in substance use. That were just elided in the mainstream tellings. And I'm like, these are fascinating stories that I want to share with people because it was incredible when I encountered them, and I wanted to share that thrill of discovery with others.
Well, I think people can probably already tell how enthusiastic you are, which is a great quality in a writer, and curious. I think at one point you say that you consume stories like Pac-Man eats ghosts. I love
Yeah.
that. And you obviously do. But also, I think you sort of flipped it because a lot of people probably were aware that some of these great people in history dabbled in drugs or too much drink, or they had slightly unconventional private lives. But the way you come at it is it's the drugs themselves that, in some cases, are driving the behavior that made them so famous. So I think it's actually quite an interesting twist on things.
Yeah, no, there's certainly, I think a lot of people underplay the influence that certainly regular drug use can have on people. Like one of the big examples is Sigmund Freud, right? So I took intro to psychology in college, and I learned about, oh, okay, so there's all these fascinating developments in regards to the subconscious mind that Freud is credited with. But Freud also has a number of more unusual ideas that are now like, oh, well, we don't really put those in. Those are sort of a historical curiosity, but it's like you look at something like penis envy or the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex, and you think, how is it that he has such absolute confidence in putting forth this idea and such enthusiasm for expounding on it? Like, where does he get this stuff? And it makes a lot more sense once you realize that for the better part of 12 years, he was coked out all day, every day. He just had extraordinary amounts of cocaine to the point where he actually wrote a whole treatise called Uber Coca that is practically an ode to cocaine, where he hails it as a wonder drug. He seemed to think that it wasn't addictive, in part because he had so much cocaine that he never ran out. And so once you realize that he is on unbelievable amounts of very high purity cocaine, it becomes a lot clearer why he has such energy and is willing to absolutely support even these super crazy ideas. He is completely confident because he is coked out the entire time.
Well, let's go back to the beginning because I love the stuff
Yeah.
in the book about the ancient world.
Yes.
And what is it? The Pharaoh you described as being, he was high and mighty.
Yes.
Maybe he was mighty because he was high. But no,
Yes.
I do love all that stuff. I mean, I love the story about the Delphic Oracle because I had no idea. Please tell us that story because it's so entertaining.
Absolutely. So, yeah, for anyone in the audience who doesn't know, of course, the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece was seen as when kings and leaders and other people wanted to know the answer to the big questions in life, they would go to this. It was a series of woman priests in this place called Delphi, in this cave complex, and they would go there, and it was believed that the Oracle of Delphi had a direct line to the gods. Like she could hear the words of the gods, and she would give these cryptic, mysterious answers. And in mythology, it is never considered that the oracle could be wrong. It's someone could interpret their words
Right,
wrong,
right,
but
right,
the
right.
oracle is never wrong. And so the Oracle of Delphi, this person who is seen to have a line to the gods. So they're in this cave complex all day that others only occasionally enter into. Cave is full of fumes. There are fumes seeping up from cracks in the ground that are hallucinogenic. You inhale them and you have visions. And so she is just saturating in this environment all day. And so
So
the
what actual properties did this smoke have? Is it possible to know now, or are you just making an educated guess?
again, this is educated guesswork, but I mean it is. It's huffing fumes
Yeah, yeah,
essentially. So it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
just smoke. It's like there's vapors seeping up from the rocks in the ground. Like there's chemical processes going on underground that are causing the release of this haze that she is inhaling. So she's pretty much constantly high
Mm.
and in this weird ethereal trip state. And this sort of drugged out trance is the state that they believe is the possession of the gods.
Brilliant stuff. And I think even further back in time, of course, the pharaohs of Egypt, when they start, I mean, didn't know half the stuff in your book, but I particularly didn't know this, that when they started analyzing mummies in the sort of 18th and 19th century, 20th century, when they're finding all these tombs, they're covered in marijuana residue. I mean,
Oh yeah.
were they
Yeah, no, when they
smoking it, or were
found
they eating it, or what were they doing?
um it seems likely that they probably ingested cannabis in a couple different ways. Given that it was ancient Egypt, I'm guessing maybe like ceramic pipes or eating it, maybe mixed with like honey or other stuff like that and made into a kind of a paste. Probably ingesting and smoking alike. So I would guess that, but also there was, of course, the practice of grave goods, where you'd be buried with all the stuff that you would want in the afterlife. Pharaohs would be buried with, and so obviously, and unfortunately, damp and age and all kinds of stuff degrade a lot of these things. But it's striking that even with all that, the cannabis pollen still survived after all of that. It does seem to
Well,
indicate both a decent consumption in life and perhaps being buried with some, in death. Again, like the organs of mummies were removed and things were stuffed into them. It is entirely possible that some cannabis was put inside simply as a memento of, well, this is the kind of goods that they would want in life, you know?
well, that's right. If you're going to cross the river Styx, or whatever it was called in Egyptian mythology, you'd like a nice, relaxing joint. But of course, you live in Los Angeles. You could order one now on Deliveroo. I mean, I guess it
Oh
was
yeah,
a similar
nowadays.
culture.
Yeah, nowadays it's a bit different, but certainly back then, to be fair, if you're the pharaoh, you can absolutely get marijuana delivered. It is not an issue to
Well,
like.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, we'll get to. You already mentioned Freud. You know, drugs that we today see are quite frightened of and consider to be very serious and dangerous, societally dangerous, like cocaine and its derivatives, were so socially kind of normal in Freud's day. And you mentioned Queen Victoria, and I'm jumping ahead, but
Oh,
like I
absolutely,
said, a
yeah.
lot of it is because you know, people had just become habituated to using these things and saw value in them. It made them better at their jobs, it gave them a nice experience, but it seemed to make them sharper at their work. I mean, Coke especially was regarded as a wonder drug, wasn't it?
Oh, certainly for most of the 19th century, cocaine was legal and was seen as a novelty or as something that could help people. And it's not really until into the 20th century that anti-cocaine laws start being passed. But certainly, when Freud was doing cocaine, not only was the cocaine legal, but as a respected member of the medical community in Vienna, he was oftentimes not even having to pay for the cocaine. He was just writing to pharmaceuticals companies saying, "Hi, I'm a doctor and I'm interested in your product. Can I have some free samples?" And they were like, "Sure, here's some high grade cocaine." And they don't just give him cocaine because, like, yeah, you're a doctor, I trust you. It,
That's so
it was just
funny.
a very different
And was
ecosystem.
it the same kind of cocaine? Was it the purity, the quality of it? Was it, would we regard it today? Were any of us taking it as the good stuff?
It would, yes, because it was medical grade cocaine. It was because obviously the coca leaf is an ancient plant. For a very long time, the indigenous people in the mountains of South America have chewed coca leaf, and coca leaves are like 5% cocaine by volume. So for the most part, that they stave off altitude sickness. They let you work longer, eat less food, but it's not really like doing cocaine. It's a very different. But then the big breakthrough is in the 19th century, the Europeans start extracting the cocaine so they can get very high. Like the cocaine as a powder, that's what
Hmm.
they start being able to get. And they find that this has some very remarkable properties. And so they start using it all over for all kinds of things. Like Freud prescribed it to his patients as well, but it also gets used in chewing gum and in wine. And Queen Victoria was actually a fan of both the chewing gum and the wine that was infused with cocaine. And in fact, another one of the people in my book is Pope Leo the 13th, who drank cocaine wine. And again, it's like the fact that the Pope drank cocaine wine enough to give a Vatican gold medal to the person who made it and then appear in a full page ad endorsing it was just not considered like.
That is incredible. That is amazing. Well,
Yeah,
sorry, I am jumping around historically because I'm just following the conversation. But I'm going back a little bit.
yeah.
We said earlier that it wasn't just that famous people used drugs; it was the drugs maybe made the people famous and allowed them to do great things. And one of the things I didn't know is that half of the Bible, or at least some important parts of the Bible, appear to have been influenced by magic mushrooms. Which
Well,
that
the
side blew my mind.
the Book of Revelation specifically. I'm not sure how much of the rest of the Bible, but certainly
Okay.
that very specific part of the New Testament that is so full of this phantasmagorical imagery of the apocalypse. Like a lot of what the Christian understanding of the apocalypse is, that comes from the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is yeah, it's written by a guy who, in all likelihood, ingested and not like the psilocybin mushrooms you can get in like Amsterdam, not like the fun kind, the kind that are, that cause violent convulsions and vomiting, like that are Amanita muscaria, fly agaric. That's stuff that they've used as an insecticide for ages.
My
So
God.
yeah, this early Christian John, before back when Christianity is still being persecuted by the Roman Empire, he gets exiled to the Greek island of Patmos. The idea, I guess, is that his heresy will be away from the rest of the empire that way, and so he's living on Patmos as a hermit, foraging for food and doing his religious writings. And so there's another mushroom there called Amanita caesarea that apparently is pretty good eating. So it's believed that he was trying to get some of the Amanita caesarea and he got the Amanita muscaria instead. So he eats it and he starts having these horrifying hallucinations and convulsions and visions of hell and the apocalypse and the end of days. And he writes this down and it becomes this powerful apocalyptic thing. But you look at this and it has very clear signs of this is what a terrible trip is like for an
Mm.
extremely religious person living in that time.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that if anyone has read the Book of Revelations, and it's influenced so much art and movies
Oh,
over
so
the
much.
years, I mean, and it is completely balmy. I mean, it's absolutely off the. He was probably
Yeah.
off his face to write it. Of course, he was. Yeah, I don't know. It's so. I think you just make me look at stories in a new way. I mean, I didn't know, for example, I think I'd heard about George Washington and his teeth, the fact that
Yeah.
he famously had these bad teeth. But well, you should explain that they also maybe led, and it's appropriate, we're talking just after the 4th of July, that one of
Yeah, no,
America's
absolutely.
greatest founding fathers was quite likely high on opium for most of his adult life.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of people, there's this weird misconception. So people will get that there was something wrong with his teeth, but the thing they'll have heard is that he had wooden teeth. And no,
Yeah, I'm sure I knew that from some visit to
like
some
you, that's
museum
what you
once.
always hear. It's what I've heard everywhere, but it's like the truth is even crazier. He wishes he had wooden teeth. That would have been less nasty than what he actually had in his mouth. What he actually had in his mouth was a primitive Frankensteinian nightmare of dentures that were okay. So parts of it were made with teeth taken from corpses. Parts of it were made with teeth that had been pulled from slaves that he owned.
My
So there's a
God.
whole moral horror there.
So you've got a
And
mixture of
parts,
teeth in your mouth from dead
a
bodies
mixture of
and live slaves.
live slaves, and some of them were from livestock, like cows
Oh my
and
God.
other stuff like that. And so these were all crudely wired together and put in like a metal frame and then jammed into his mouth and anchored onto the one tooth he still actually had. And this this dental nightmare is if you ever look at any picture of George Washington, like all the paintings, the image on the dollar bill, he's never smiling in any of them, and he always looks like really uncomfortable, and his lips almost seem like they're trying to hold his teeth in his mouth. And in part, that's because they didn't fit in his mouth very well, so he was in almost constant pain. But at the same time, a person without teeth can't talk very well. And if
Hmm.
you can't talk very well, it's kind of hard to lead a revolution and then to lead a fledgling nation. So it was seen that, well, we have no choice but to ram these terrible teeth into his mouth. And if we're going to put these things into his mouth, we're going to have to give him opium on a regular basis, or else he will go insane from pain. So he's being treated with laudanum.
Right, which was incredibly, I mean, that wasn't known, of course, as the main pain relief for
Oh, yeah,
centuries.
laudanum was everywhere. It was just so widely. I mean, certainly this was a time when you could buy it at any corner
But
store.
it would have affected his mood. It would have affected his judgment, no doubt,
Oh, yeah.
having so much of that. I mean, he didn't have to be Samuel Taylor Coleridge and write a weird poem. But, maybe he wouldn't have done some of the crazy things he did without the influence of the drugs. Perhaps the revolution would never have succeeded. I don't know. It's interesting.
But yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating thing to think about. In his case, certainly, it does seem like it was mostly for medical use, and it didn't. Like some people would get really wild on, like, again, I mentioned Alexander the Great, in addition to drinking himself to death, plus opium, he also, again, while once drunk out of his mind, he murdered a friend of his due to an argument, and that friend had previously saved him in battle. So that's someone who is completely out of control of themselves when they're really, and it doesn't seem like Washington was on that level. Like the
No.
errors in judgment that Washington made in his life, like his earlier tactical errors in the French and Indian War back when he was still fighting on the side of the British, those were probably not attributable to his opium use, but certainly there are other historical figures who definitely made blunders caused by drugs. I mean, you certainly wonder about if the Bay of Pigs with John F. Kennedy was influenced by the fact that John F. Kennedy was doing tons of drugs.
Well, interesting. I remember studying medieval history back in the day when I was a student, and
Yes.
one of the lecturers said the thing you have to remember about some of these princes and kings who fight these amazing wars. I mean, I guess Alexander the Great would be part of that list. Is that they're just teenage boys, a lot of them.
Oh yeah.
They're leading armies at 17 or 18. They're experiencing kind of hormonal rages and furies, and they want to prove themselves. And, great tides of history are affected by these kind of adolescent rages. But if you added the fact that they're probably also stoned,
Oh no,
you don't get
certainly.
for a very kind of settled political community or international relations. Amazing.
Certainly, and frankly, that they don't have to be young guys to be like that either. I mean, there's the terrifying example of Richard Nixon is in the book because Richard Nixon was a really bad stress drinker. Like when he got stressed, he would drink. And given that he both did a lot of illegal stuff and then became president and presided over a hugely unpopular war, he had a lot of things to be stressed about. So there was a point in time when he's being investigated for his criminal wrongdoings and people are protesting the Vietnam War and it's not going well. That he is routinely drunk dialing his cabinet members in the middle of the night and saying, "All right, we're going to finally do it. Let's nuke Cambodia." And they're listening and they're like, he is obviously hammered, but he is the president. Do we have to do this? And then of all the people to be the voice of reason, you have to have Henry Kissinger stepping in and saying, "Don't worry, he is so hammered that he will forget this all in the morning." And sure enough, he would wake up the next morning and not remember that he had asked people to drop nuclear bombs on another country last night because he was so hammered. Yeah, Kissinger
Gosh.
said if the president had it his way, there would be a nuclear war every week.
Wow. I mean, I guess that's a modern day version of Alexander the Great, but thankfully he had better advisors around him. Maybe we should be grateful that Mr. Trump doesn't drink and smoke. Well, as far as we know, he doesn't do drugs. Maybe you'll tell me differently. Isn't he famously
As
teetotal?
I
You're not sure?
president claims that he does not do drugs or drink. I don't have any evidence to say otherwise, but frankly, this is the kind of thing where we often don't know until people have passed what their real habits are like. That kind
Yes.
of stuff is usually in people's private documents, so it's hard to speculate on things about any person who's still living, and
Well,
also
of
the fact
course.
that living people can sue you.
That is also true. So, actually, the one talking of American presidents, I mean, I really, really enjoyed because I didn't know much about Andrew Jackson. But
Yes.
I think, I said your book is not academic in style, it's very entertaining in style. I think at one point you say, let's just call it as we see it. This guy was a racist douchebag.
Oh yeah,
But I
yeah. No,
mean, what a story. Give us a quick bio, please, of Andrew Jackson, because a lot of non-American readers won't know much about him.
okay. So Andrew Jackson is basically a serial killer who became the U.S. president. So he was a wealthy slaveholder from Tennessee. And so he lived on a large plantation, and the plantation grew a lot of grain. And so he had a distillery naturally for the grain. So and he drank a lot of whiskey. He liked his whiskey and he liked violence. He fought in over 100 duels in his life.
A hundred.
And 100, yeah. So, and in one of them, he won by he literally just let the other guy shoot him and then shot the guy dead. Like they said that he had so many bullets in his body that he clanked when he walked. He
Wow.
was, uh,
Just the sort of man you need to control your entire nation.
yeah, and so he basically he became popular in combination through at a time when most people who were he was the first American president to really try and appeal to like poor, low educated white men. That was like his big thing because at the time most politics appealed to rich, high education white men.
Right.
So this
So we're
was seen as
talking what, 1830s, 40s, that sort of era?
uh yeah, like the
Yeah.
early, early
Early part of the 19th century.
century.
Got it.
Yeah. And so he was seen as both so he was known for turning his campaign parties, like his campaign rallies, into big parties where a bunch of free booze was provided, and that was a big way of connecting with his electorate. It's like, vote for me. I'm the guy who will give you booze, and I hate the same people you do, you know.
Right.
And he was also known as being a vicious fighter for the U.S., which often manifested as, he engaged in Indian removal. There was the Trail of Tears. He also
Mm.
fought viciously in numerous battles against pretty much anyone the U.S. would fight a war against. You could count on Andrew Jackson to be willing to take very extreme measures that would be very controversial, but would get him a lot of fans because he gets stuff done. He was seen as a very hardline, edgy guy. And he became very successful like that. And so at his presidential inauguration, he actually had a giant party at the White House. And it got so insane and crazy that he had to escape out a window while the people at the White House trashed it. And he eventually managed to lure the guests out by putting bathtubs full of whiskey on the lawn.
Oh, how brilliant. That sounds like a slightly more extreme version of what we had here with the so-called Partygate scandal in number 10 Downing Street. But being American, it was done on a much bigger scale. Love it.
Yeah, yeah, and if the guy who hosted the parties was also like a racist serial killer, like
Yeah, that's
like
amazing.
Andrew Jackson personally killed a lot of people. To the time when a guy tried to assassinate him, the guy pulls out two guns, points them directly at him. Both of the guns misfire, and Andrew Jackson is so infuriated, he jumps down and starts beating the would-be assassin. And several Congress people have to wrestle him off so he doesn't beat the guy to death in broad daylight. Like,
Amazing. That is a completely interesting prism to see the past and the characters that, made history happen. I do love that. And actually,
oh yeah.
just because I'm looking at the clock and I'm running a little bit towards the end of our slot, but the modern stuff is really fascinating too. I mean, I think I knew that Steve Jobs was
Yeah.
was was a bit of a druggie, but a lot of these high tech internet um, pioneers seem to have been very closely connected to the Californian drug culture, but perhaps none more so than John McAfee, whose story you tell very entertainingly. And again, I knew little about him, and crikey, he was mad, wasn't he? God.
Yeah, yeah. So John McAfee, the pioneers of the antivirus app, and arguably a pioneer of like kind of scare marketing in computers as well, because a big part of why he was so successful in marketing the his antivirus software was that he helped monetize paranoia, saying like, listen, like all of these viruses, there are people out there who just make stuff that will wreck your computer, and they do it for no reason other than that they can. But this is your way to try and stand against that. And so that was what made him big financially. But he was known, he worked at all these like top flight companies for various short periods of time because he would always inevitably get fired for things like doing cocaine in his office or like trying to sell cocaine to other employees or just generally inappropriate behavior and wacky stuff. He eventually I think got pushed out of his own company and started saying, you know what, McAfee is a scam actually. Like the antivirus that has my name is, it's garbage. And he later his
Yeah,
life got.
he goes off to some desert island where he ends up murdering someone. I mean,
I believe
really, it is like a kind of crazy Joseph Conrad novel, his
he
life.
moved to a jungle compound in Belize where
Belize.
yeah, and there in Belize, he was like living on like an I think like an island fortress, like an island like fortified compound with a bunch of bodyguards and parties and like various like groupies. And it was this whole weird like den of hedonism where he would do a bunch of weird experimental drugs that he got off the internet and talk about. He was big into bath salts, if you remember that, those drugs that like it was some kind of a sort of like synthetic psychedelic amphetamine that you could buy on like in sketchy shops and on the internet for a while. And
Okay.
he was really into that. And specifically, he would write posts on the internet about the importance of putting that stuff up your butt. Um, like apparently he called it, I think, plugging or stacking or he had multiple terms for it. He also called it psycho perv powder.
This is
But so
definitely going to be our first X-rated episode of this podcast. But no, it's fascinating.
yeah, but yeah. So, anyways, one of his neighbors gets mad at the fact that he has a bunch of poorly trained guard dogs, and I think one of his neighbors, also being kind of a lunatic, poisoned some of his guard dogs, and he responded by murdering his neighbor. So, yeah, that well,
And
I
what
don't.
happens to him in the end, for those who don't know?
I believe he ends up in prison in Spain, and I don't think that they could prove that he murdered the guy in Belize. So it was technically for massive tax evasion, which he openly admitted that like I have not given any money to the IRS in like 2 decades. So he didn't make a secret of it. And so while in jail for tax evasion in Spain, he said, "Hey everyone, I just want to let you know that I'm in totally good spirits. And so if I commit suicide, it was definitely a conspiracy." Like, and then he commits suicide immediately afterwards, just as a sort of like a way to give the two fingers to everybody
Wow.
as he's going out. Like he
No,
definitely did commit suicide, but he said that because he died as he lived, being a troll.
yeah, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. At the end of your book, you come to a kind of it's a bit of a plea for moderation. I mean, I mentioned you live in California, in a
Yes.
state, in a country where drugs are much more kind of freely available. And that experiment, some people think it's gone well, some don't. Clearly, that's a bit of an outlier when it comes to the rest of the world. But
Yes.
I think you make the case that, like the internet itself, drugs can be very useful and they can be very terrible. And we just need to be a little bit more kind of balanced in our views. Is that a fair précis of what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's these things are they have yeah, they're not inherently good or bad, but they have upsides, downsides. Some tools are more dangerous than other tools. Like, there's a butter knife and a chainsaw are both tools, but they have different levels of inherent risk. And so I feel like these things can be used properly, and there's a place for a lot of these things, but a lot of it the, there needs to be more awareness, more education, and more willingness to acknowledge the nuances of reality instead of either trying to glorify or demonize.
I mean, do you think the legalization experiment in California has worked? Are you comfortable with that?
Yes, yes, I would say so.
Okay, interesting.
I don't think that it's been any kind of negative. I think I think that would probably work well if applied many other places.
Well, I think I came away from your book with a really well, a very entertained, which I guess is
Yes.
the first priority of any writer, but just with a completely new sense of how some of the bigger stories in the world played out. And just that old thing, people have often said, is it economic forces that shape our world? Is it, the environment that shapes our world, weather patterns, or is it just human beings being a little bit mad, and changing things and I think you probably fall on that side of that argument. And
There's definitely there's a lot of different things that shape the world, but certainly the the spectacular peculiarities of human nature shape so much of the world around us that I really think it's worth delving into just how odd they really can be.
that's a lovely way of putting it, actually, and I would totally agree with you. And that's very much what your book does. So well done, and thank you so much for sharing it for half an hour with me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm
All the
happy to.
best, Sam. Take care. The window cleaners have been knocking behind your back, so I hope they're all right.
Oh, no, they're all right. There's people doing yard work outside.
Ah, of course they are. All right. I hope they're not delivering your next shipment. See you later. Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
good one.
You too,
Bye.
mate. Thank you. Spectacular peculiarities of human nature. Well, we get a lot of that on here. We do. And I don't just mean you, Jonathan Brewer, or the lovely commenters who come on the YouTube page. It's what it's all about, isn't it? You know, that's why we read books and watch programs and make programs and tell stories, celebrating the very odd creatures that we are and the times that we live in. So I enjoyed that. Yeah, different kind of a book, different kind of a style. I said like magazine articles, very snappy. I think it's a sort of book that kids would love. I mean, maybe not very young kids because it's about drugs, but teenagers, young adults. I think they would really enjoy that and learn a lot about history in along the way. So a couple of things. When I mentioned King Cora earlier, I showed you a picture of me meeting with Chris Moore. Chris Moore, that's my Ulster accent. Chris Moore, King Cora. He and I and Andrew Loney and others have spent a long time on this story. And if you remember the very first episode of this podcast, which still gets quite a bit of attention, Andrew believes that Lord Louis Mountbatten has a case to answer from beyond the grave for being a predatory paedophile in Ireland, largely, in the 60s and 70s. And Andrew Loney has linked Mountbatten to the abuse that went on in King Cora and other cases of boys being taken to parties to meet men or taken to great country houses like his own. Andrew alleges this happened, and he's talked to people who claimed it happened to them. Now, Chris Moore, in his new book, has also got into the Mountbatten story. I don't think it's. If you watch the very first episode, I mean, I really am impressed with the evidence. I don't know if it's completely conclusive, but there's clearly a case to answer. And certainly Chris Moore, who I respect enormously, now believes, I don't think he did 20 years ago, but now he believes that Mountbatten was quite likely involved in a ring in and around King Cora. And this isn't just about abuses. The boys disappeared. At least one of them died. Some people were never accounted for. There was something very dark and very terrible happening around that children's home. Police learnt about it, and for 5 years they were told not to do anything because people involved were very important. We always assumed that was because they were paramilitaries or they were connected to paramilitaries. But maybe it's because they're also very important people involved at the highest levels of British society. And maybe one of them was Mountbatten, maybe. It's a story that just keeps on going. But Chris's book is fantastic. And yes, it does. I should have mentioned that earlier. It does go into that whole area that Andrew has gone into with Mountbatten on Ireland at that time. I think I'm done. Oh, one more thing. I mentioned before about my Australian tour in October. I know a lot of you are listening and watching in Australia. Thank you. I do seem to have quite a few people subscribing from there. I think just about more Brits, but definitely second is Australians now. Third is Americans. I get to see the data. So I'm going to be in Australia. Ticket sales are slow. Let's face it, I'm not a household name. Should I be? Maybe I should. Ticket sales are a bit slow. So I've put into the bio of this episode a list of links of all the places where I'm going to be speaking. They're either free or like $10. There's one in Perth on the 9th of October at the State Library. Then the next day I'm in Melbourne. Yes, I fly and speak on the same day to Melbourne. Reading's Bookshop, Hawthorne, with Professor Claire Wright, a friend of mine who's very prominent and quite well known in Australia. I'm also speaking at a conference in Melbourne, which is a whole day-long thing, and that's like $100. So I'm not sure if that would appeal. That's maybe for the nerds. Then I'm going to Sydney, speaking on the 12th twice, once in the Maritime Museum with my old friend Chris Masters, very well-known reporter in Australia, really a bit of a household name, I think, still. Chris and I will be on stage at the Maritime Museum in the early afternoon. Then that evening, I'm speaking at the Petersham Bowling Club. More relaxed, it'll be just an hour of chat, and then we'll no doubt sound for lots of drink in the lovely warm spring evening. Oh, October in Sydney. It is heaven. The jacarandas will be out. Yes, that'll be a lovely thing. That's like $10 to come along, hear me spouting on in Sydney, maybe have a glass of wine, and we can talk about the book or whatever you like afterwards. I might even sign a copy for you. How's that? And then finally, on the 15th of October, I'm in Canberra. This is really exciting. I'm with Christine Helliwell, a very, very respected writer. We cover some of the same stories in our recent books, and I'm at the Australian War Memorial, which is, if you don't know, just a wonderful institution. Then to speak there is really exciting, and I think that's around lunchtime. And there are links in the bio. So if you have any interest in any of the things I've talked about, or would just like to say good day, that's where I'll be. And if you've got any friends in Perth, especially, do tell them to come, because that one is really quite, yes, ticket sales are slow, especially in Perth. Anyway, there you go. Come and see me on my tour. I'm coming anyway, even if it's just 5 people. We'll go to the pub. Okay, thanks very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Bye. Oh, no, actually, no. I can't completely promise. I think the next episode will be Andrew Loney. Lots of things are in place. He's launching his book internationally. It's a big deal. There are serial things happening, serializations. But I think in 2 weeks' time, I'll be talking to Andrew about his book on Prince and on his book on Andrew and Fergie, which is going to be a global sensation. And you're going to hear it all here first. All right, all the best. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.